little bat in the corner. Okay, there was one little bat in the corner, and Debbie caught it with a small hand net, and it was a pallid bat, and like this pallid bat. So this is the very first bat that I ever saw up close, and I've been fascinated with bats ever since. So the pallid bat is one of our 28 species in Arizona. It has this pig-like nose. Let's see if I can get my pointer here. Pig-like nose, big ears. It has really pale colored fur. It's actually kind of white at the base with blonde tips. It has this odor producing glands on its snout, and it smells kind of like a skunk. So, you know, if we're out catching bats, a lot of times we'll pass the pallid bat around and show everybody how, or have everybody take a sniff, and they smell like skunks. They feed on really large insects and scorpions and centipedes. So they're a really cool bat to talk about because they're really pretty fierce. They fly really close to the ground, and they listen for the frequencies that ground-dwelling insects make with their really large ears. And this is a real kind of generalist sort of species. They roost in rock crevices, they'll roost in mines, also buildings. They'll roost in a lot of different kind of places. And they could be found up to about 100 individuals, but it's certainly common to find them in smaller groups than that. So looking at that first bat, I didn't know any of these things. And I just thought, wow, this little creature is so fascinating. I'd never seen a bat face. I'd never seen a bat wing. I'd never seen a bat up close. So bats belong to the order Chiroptera, which means hand wing. And unlike a bird wing or insect wings, which tend to be more rigid, and move only in a few directions, a bat's wing contains the bat's entire hand. You can see this is its forearm. The thumb of the bat sticks up just a little bit there. When you have a bat in hand, it's real obvious where the thumb is. So there's the wrist, and then each of its other fingers. So they have this really elastic membrane, a couple dozen joints, a thin elastic membrane, and that can stretch and really kind of grab the air. So bats are operating with the exact same skeletal system that we have, but obviously they have elongated fingers, and the membrane, it's just really soft. If you've never felt a bat wing, they're just really surprisingly soft and strong and very pliable, and just really like elastic. So the Southwest is a great place to study bats. We have some of the richest diversity in the entire US. So Texas is the state with the most bat species. They have about, I think, 32, but we're just, right below that with 28. So we have 4 different families of bats here. We have the leaf-nosed bats, and these guys are all 3 leaf-nosed bats. The California leaf-nosed bat, the lesser long-nosed bat, and the Mexican long-tongued bat. These 2 are the 2 nectar, nectar feeding bats in the state. We have one from the family Mormoops. And actually, even though we include this in our species list, a couple of them were captured in the 1950s, but they probably don't really live here in Arizona. They were a couple of vagrant bats, but we've included them on our species list. Most of our bats belong to the Vespertilionidae family, or the plain-nosed bats. And if you look around, you'll see that a lot of these guys just have kind of plain faces, even though some of them have really big ears. And like these guys, these are tree bat species, but they also belong to that plain-nosed bat family. And then we have the free-tailed bats. So the Mexican free-tailed bat is a really common species in Arizona and throughout the Southwest. When you hear about bats that number in the millions, it is that species. A lot of times bats do not number anywhere near that. And then there's 5 total of these free-tailed bat species, and they've got these kind of club-shaped ears, and they're really, really fast-flying bats. And it includes one of the largest species of bat in the U.S., the Western Mastiff bat. So as far as my job goes, you've probably seen this meme. It's kind of funny. There's memes for like a lot of different job kind of things. What people think you do, what you actually do. So my job, I do a really wide variety of things. And certainly being out in the field is the coolest part of what I do. But I also sit on several committees. I have monthly meetings for white nose syndrome, to stay on top of that, to discuss, what to do next about it. It's, survey efforts that are underway, and just talk about, different types of bat issues with other Western state biologists. I also review a lot of projects to assess their potential impact to bats, such as wind development projects, solar projects, when new roads are being built, if a bridge is having maintenance on it, or if it's, a bridge that's being rebuilt. Those are just some examples. I also help people with their nuisance bat issues, because bats do show up on people's patios and they don't want them there. I apply for grants. So I really do a variety of things, which is one of the things that I really love about my job. There is a lot of great variety in it. But certainly monitoring bats is one of the, really cool aspects of my job that I enjoy the most. So why do we monitor bats? Well, it's probably pretty obvious to a bunch of conservation biologists like yourselves. We want to know, how our species of greatest conservation need are doing. And so that's an Arizona Game and Fish Department term for the species that we're paying closest attention to. They're about probably, I think there's about, we just have been in the process of redoing that list. Which is another thing that, I've worked on recently, just kind of evaluating each bat species and trying to determine where they fit in terms of how concerned we should be for them. There's probably about 15 or 16 bats on the list. Not all because they're endangered or anything like that, but just, because we want to pay attention to them, or we don't know enough about certain species and things like that. Also to monitor for environmental threats such as wind. How is, as you've probably heard, wind developments really impact bats. They tend to kill a lot of bats as they're migrating through. So we monitor those kinds of projects. White nose syndrome, looking to see, has white nose syndrome arrived in Arizona? Doesn't appear to have arrived in Arizona yet. But we monitor for that to try to determine at what point it is here. Other project assessments are important. And then just, bats are vital components to the ecosystem. They do a lot of good for our environment. They're long-lived creatures, and they're really slow to reproduce. So they eat a lot of pests, which is, one of the things that they're really super famous for. So I've kind of structured this talk to talk about kind of our monitoring goals and to focus on that. And through those monitoring goals, I was going to highlight some of the ways that a bat researcher goes out and does this work, how we might collect information to determine species distribution, population trends, what we might look at to determine those management impacts and disease surveillance. So taking species distribution. So where are species? Which ones are present or absent from an area? which ones are common, which ones are rare. So to answer these questions, we might do capture surveys, or sometimes we do roost surveys. We more and more are putting acoustic detectors out on the landscape to collect information about where bats are. And those are fantastic in many ways, because you don't have to, you can leave a detector out, it passively collects information, and then you get the data, download it, and you get a pretty good idea. You don't get an idea of like the abundance of a particular species in an area. Like you can't say there were 100 of a particular bat, but you do know kind of relative, once. And if you hear sounds, I have 3 dogs in my room, so there might be some flapping occasionally. But you get the, which ones are most common in a particular area, seasonally, which ones show up. You can really get a lot of information from acoustics. And these types of surveys are primarily done in the summer, but not always. We can do surveys all year round in Arizona. So for capture events, we go to places where bats travel or congregate. So that might be at their roosts or their foraging areas, travel corridors. In the desert, it's common you can capture hundreds of bats at even a small water tank, because there's so little water available. So that really concentrates the bats in particular areas. We also will put our nets up at dry washes, openings to forests. In this photo here, you can see these folks, they're in waders so that they can wade into the water. They've got they're setting a triple high net. So they've got these really, really long poles, and they've got these guy lines, and they're going to put 3 mist nets on this thing, one on top of another, so that it creates this huge wall of mist net, so that when bats, come to drink from this pool, they're probably going to, what these folks are thinking, these bats are probably traveling through this corridor here. And when they come out to get a drink, or when they're heading in there, because it's probably a route that they fly nightly, they're going to get caught in this net because they're not going to see it. And using a triple high net can be really valuable, because we get kind of a bias when we net with a single high. Not all bats fly at that level. Some of them fly really high. So usually your capture events could be somewhat biased towards the lower flying bats, if that's what you're using. So these are some of the places. And then of course, bats are in caves. You can also net at an opening of a cave. Bats also roost under bark. Bats roost in all kinds of different places. So we find them all over. And so how do we catch bats? Well, with the nets, like I was describing, we primarily catch them with mist nets or harp traps. So these are some good photos of harp traps. And there's pros and cons, or kind of a decision process you would go through to determine which kind of net you want to use. So typically a mist net, there's a lot of flexibility with using a mist net. And like I pointed out, you can even use a triple high mist net. So they're portable and flexible. They come in different sizes. You can, usually depending on the size of pond that you're netting, you're going to array that net in a different configuration, so that if the bats try to avoid one part of the net and they try to fly over it, they'll be captured in another segment of the net. So those are the kinds of things that biologists are thinking when they're putting a net over a pond. With these harp traps, they can be really perfect for netting a small opening, like a cave opening, where maybe you want to put bands on the bat's wrist. One of the ways that we try to identify bats, like how long they've lived and things like that, we might put a band on a bat. So maybe you want, and this used to be done a lot more than it is currently. So back in the 60s, they would have these huge events where they would net, at a cave opening, and, band all of these bats to try to find, like, do they use the same sites? Do they come back? How long do they live? Things like that. Well, a harp trap would be perfect for that sort of study, because the bats, so a harp trap consists of these like fishing line that's strung really, really tight, kind of like a harp. That's where it gets its name. And when the bats fly out of this cave, they run into the fishing line and they just slide down the line, and then they end up in this bag at the bottom. So in terms of getting the bats out of the bag, it's a really easy, quick process. You just reach in and grab them out. And with a net, you know, usually the bat gets a little bit tangled and requires a little bit more expertise to take care of that. So those are the kinds of things that you'd be thinking about. A harp trap can also be used in like a confined forest area where you're netting along a trail. So those kinds of things are what you'd be thinking about. So some of the essentials. So leather gloves are one of the essential things to use. Also, we put bats in bags when we get them out of the net. Sometimes they're just plain, sometimes they're cute with little flowers. I've had these are my gloves. I've had them for a long, long time. Bats will bite when you capture them. You know, some of them are, you know, some species are very bitey and other species less so. It's almost like kind of different species have sort of, you know, like kind of a personality for the species. So some are really, so we always have rabies shots also, so that we don't have to worry about, you know, getting bitten so much. Although if you have a rabies shot and you get bitten by a bat that you think might be rabid, you would still get post-exposure shots. That rabies shot kind of boosts your immune system, keeps it high, and then you would still get some follow-up shots. Some of the other, so when we capture bats, then once the bat is removed from the net, you know, there's some physical characteristics that you would look for to determine what species it is, what, you know, you're going to tell what sex it is. These are all things that you're recording on your data sheet. The age of the bat, reproductive status. In some species, you're going to look for this keel on the calcar, which is this, so this is kind of like lingo that you would know as a bat biologist. So the keel on the calcar actually helps the bat open its tail membrane, which is useful in capturing insects on the fly. The tragus, which we have a, you know, tragus on our ear as well. The tragus is something in Myotis, it's really pointy. In other species like the canyon bat, it's club shaped. So that's something too, when you're keying out the bat species, that you would be looking at. Some of the measurements you would take, we always measure the forearm. So the forearm is this part right here of the bat. We measure using a ruler or caliper, which comes in, you know, an electronic version and a non-electronic version. When we're out mist netting, we have a processing table where all this takes place. So you capture the bat and you bring it back in the bat bag to the processing table. These folks have their bats in little paper bags, which I don't like to use. I like to use cloth bags because it's less stressful on the bat, doesn't make all that scratchy paper bag sound. But that's what they're doing. So they're, you know, you've got a data recorder and you're taking all these measurements and information and writing them down on the data sheet. Another thing that you would have is your dichotomous key. So there's a key for the entire list of bat species in Arizona. And then because we have 9 different species of Myotis and they can be really difficult to tell apart, those are the one, usually you can tell pretty much everything else, but the Myotis usually require a key of their own, such as California Myotis and the small-footed Myotis, Myotis ciliolabrum. They're so similar that even a key sometimes, I mean, look at some of these characteristics. Is the slope of the forehead abrupt or is it gently sloping? I mean, it's really hard to tell that. I remember watching people when I was first getting started, like putting their thumb against the forehead to try to determine if it was gently sloping or abrupt. And maybe after you've handled 100 bats, it becomes more apparent, but it's pretty tough. So, but some of our species, like these three examples, I mean, once you see them, you don't even have to use a key. I mean, this is a spotted bat. It's got, you know, it's black with 3 big white spots. It's got these huge pink ears. You can't mistake that for anything else. The hoary bat, really, you know, loud bat. It can be pretty nasty. Beautiful though, like beautiful, beautiful fur. It's a tree bat, and it doesn't look like anything else. And then, you know, the largest species of bat, the Western Mastiff bat, is just huge. So we're fortunate in Arizona, we have a lot of species like that. So we also take the weight of the bat. So we'll have a scale. The weight can be taken in a little piece of Tupperware. A lot of times we use a clear Ziploc bag and put the bat in the Ziploc bag and kind of roll it up and put it on the scale. I've also used a toilet paper roll, which I found worked really, really well. So this little guy is in a toilet paper roll with the end kind of pinched and taped. And so like the natural tendency of a bat, especially a small bat, is to kind of, you know, back up inside something. So this kind of takes advantage of what their natural tendency would be. They want to stay up inside there where it's safe. You plop that down on the scale and get the quick weight. So this is our processing table, the data sheets. You always have to have snacks like Oreos or Lay's potato chips. And then some of our other equipment. And it's really cool to work with other bat biologists because everybody's got their gear kind of, you know, they do things a little bit different. And so it's always great to learn from a variety of people. When I first got started, I thought there was one way to do things, and then you work with other people and you're like, wow, that's a clever thing I wouldn't have thought of. So, and then this is just an example of, you know, how we determine the age. So this is a close-up shot of the finger joint, finger bone of a juvenile bat. So what we do is we shine our headlamp light through the third finger, and you look to see if this has ossified or whether there's still cartilage there. And so there's this little break that is apparent in a juvenile bat. That means that its bones haven't ossified yet. But I think they lose that relatively young, so they could still be pretty young and have that or have lost that. Okay, so capture surveys are a really important monitoring tool for documenting species distribution when we want to capture bats in an area. And then we have the ability to go back year after year and determine, you know, whether there's changes in the distribution of bats that we're capturing. You know, wow, we used to capture more cave myotis here, and now we're not catching any. So those are the kinds of things that you can kind of key in on long term. So another type of monitoring we do is population trend monitoring. So we're always asking, you know, how is the species doing? Is its population stable? Is it increasing or decreasing? And when we say population, that can mean, you know, different things. So it's always important to clarify, you know, in your research study or when you're talking with someone and they say, hey, let's go do a population study. You know, is it the population of a single roost? Or is it the population of all of that species within Arizona? So those are different things we might look at. And so, you know, to make sure that the method we're using is appropriate. So I'm going to talk about just a couple of examples of population monitoring. And I'm going to use the lesser longnose bat and the Mexican free-tailed bat as my examples.
Wait, I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
So, like, given that they're like aerial species, and you said like maybe it might change from one year to the next, do they like usually stay in the same place for long periods of time, like till the end of time or until their population declines, or do they ever move roosts?
So bats are really, they have a really high fidelity to their roosts, and they tend to go back year after year. So we see the same, like with the lesser long-nosed bats, every year they come to the exact same roost. So, in this example, we count that site every June, and we get an estimate, for that particular site. And then year after year, how is that number doing? So what we believe is, probably changes somewhat, like the male bats that are born at that roost disperse somewhere else. Males and females tend to live apart. And so things like that, dispersal is happening, but it's kind of the best way that we have, and that's why those types of surveys are done in the summertime, where we can look at this roost and say, okay, Mexican free-tails live at this roost, and the number of bats here tends to be about 50,000 every year. Is kind of how, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So for the lesser long-nosed bat, so this was an endangered species. It was listed in 1988, but it was actually delisted a couple of years ago. It was removed from the endangered species list because it was determined to be recovered. So when it was first listed, these are some of the reasons that it was listed. There was a lot of concern that there were population declines happening. Some of the roosts where biologists were visiting didn't have bats. And so anyway, lots of concern. And then, there was a huge amount of concern that this species was really a keystone for the Sonoran Desert. And without it, the whole ecosystem was going to die. So we've since learned that, a lot of species pollinate saguaro cactus. I mean, we have saguaro cactus obviously up in the Phoenix area and even north of here, and we don't have this species up here. So obviously something else is pollinating, the saguaro cactus up here. But at the time, it was a huge concern, and so it was listed. So for each year, for about the last 20 years or so, biologists have monitored. So this species arrives in Arizona. It also stays in Mexico. There's kind of at least two population segments. So there's some that just stay there. There's others that migrate up just over the border into Arizona. And they arrive in April or May. And there's only 3 maternity sites in Arizona for the species. One of them is quite large. There's about 25 to 50,000 female bats at this site. And the others are a little bit smaller. So what we do is we have this annual roost count. The biologists go to these sites on the same night, and they sit outside and they count the bats as they come out of the mine or cave. I think, let's see, these are all mines actually. So, and we've been doing that for, like I said, 20 years. And so part of what that entails, because it's really hard to count 50,000 bats, and this particular species tends to come out after it is dark, which some species come out more kind of at sunset. So they come out, and we video record them with infrared lights and special night vision adapted Sony camera. There's other methods for doing it. You can do live counts using night vision goggles and things like that. But for large colonies and to have a historic record of the bats, it's really handy to use one of these video cameras. Then you can just turn the video camera on and then count it later. And you can use slow motion and all that kind of handy stuff. That's handy when you're counting that number of bats. Some of the other equipment you might use, in those kinds of surveys, a map and a hard hat with a really high-powered, headlamp. And so this is an example of the information that we get from that. And in particular at this site at Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, that helped us to know that it was okay to remove this species from the endangered species list. And so here you see these count numbers over time and how at this particular roost, the numbers have actually been increasing. And we had that information for all the sites. And of course, we had to take in account other things and border activities, and there's a lot more that goes into it, you know, and climate change and things like that. But ultimately, this is what helped us to make that decision. So for the Mexican free-tailed bat example, this is a single roost. And this is what it looks like when we're, you know, videoing. And this is why it's handy to video record this site, because can you imagine trying to count what's coming out of there? I didn't even have the attention span to like just, you know, focus on it long enough to feel accurate about it. So this is a single roost. And even though this species is like one of the most common species in the state, this particular site we feel is really vulnerable because it is probably the largest site in Arizona, and it's a maternity colony, and it's really remote. So it's protected in that way because not many people know about it. It's really tough to get to, but we check on it every year because we want to make sure that, you know, there isn't some crazy event or something like that that puts these guys at risk. Because for some reason, this species probably needs these really huge, like mega sites to help with, you know, that it just factors into their to their reproduction and breeding and how, you know, these really huge sites seem to be really important to this species, even though it also has many smaller sites as well. And this is kind of a close-up of the Mexican free-tailed bat. We have these are found in urban areas too. We've got at 40th Street and Camelback, there's a colony of about 10,000 of these bats. There's also about 30,000 that live under the Gilbert Bridge where it crosses the Salt River. So really common species. They can fly really super fast. They can fly really super far. And they're just, you know, and this is just what we know. There's just so much about bats that we don't know because they are really challenging to study. Okay, so management and development impacts. We monitor for those sorts of things. I'm going to just give a couple quick examples because I know I'm talking a lot here and I want to leave time for questions. So, you know, we monitor for like bat gate projects. So to protect a roost, sometimes we will close it with a gate, which if there's a bat colony living inside, you know, a lot of agencies are, you know, we don't want the public to be put at risk. People fall into these things or they walk into them and get exposed to gases or whatever, like we were talking about kind of early on. They can be dangerous places. So we might put a bat gate. But for example, the Mexican free-tailed bats, they can't live with a bat gate. They fly so fast and there's so many of them, it doesn't work. If it's a large enough site, you can have like a half gate and they can fly out over the top. So these are the kinds of things that we will study to help, you know, inform our future decisions or to see how it works. You know, we know these work really well for some species and for others, they might abandon the roost. So we might study it to find that out. I mentioned Gilbert Bridge. They're actually going to be replacing that bridge in a couple of years. And we are going to be working with them to hopefully move the bats into the new bridge. And the new bridge is going to have bat habitat added into it. And so that'll be a whole big process of, you know, trying to determine whether what we're doing is working or not. Wind development also really important to study to see like what can we do to make these less lethal for bats. So one of the tools that we use, we monitor with bat acoustics. So monitoring with sound, you know, I'm sure everyone is aware, you know, bats are excellent echolocators, and many of them have very unique sounds that they make. So for example, this big brown bat, you know, it has this echolocation signature. So when the device records the bats as they're flying around in the area, you download it and run it through a special analysis software, and determine, you know, what species are in there in the area based on these sonograms that we go through and identify. So what some of that can tell us, so a lot of times with these wind projects, we'll put acoustic detectors out to see what is flying in the area to try to determine what might be most at risk before the wind development goes in, or even after the wind project goes in, to see, you know, what the species are, as well as carcass surveys get done. You know, the wind developers will have a crew of consultants that go through and look for the dead, you know, birds and bats to see which species are getting hit the most. And so this information can tell us, you know, what, I mean, especially during migration time. So in the months of August and September, especially with the hoary bat, this is you know, these sites are really lethal to this particular species, and we don't know exactly why. We don't know if they're attracted to wind farms, if they're migrating through and turn off their echolocation and they're just flying. There could be a variety of reasons. These tree bats may be attracted because they look like tall things on the landscape, and bats are probably very curious about their environment and end up checking things out. And oh, this is just funny, so I included it. Okay, and so as part of the NA-BAT that I sent you, we are doing more and more acoustics. We have these grid cells. The whole state is, there's just a giant grid cell over the state. And then we've got these sites. They're not exactly randomly selected, but they are you know, part of the sampling unit that is across the United States that will help us, you know, across the US get better information about trends. So it's more statistically valid way of collecting this information in a way that can help inform trends in broader areas versus just in kind of a smaller regional area. And so it entails, you know, putting this microphone on top of a 12-foot pole to get kind of up away from the ground, and you've got your acoustic detector, and we can just easily deploy these anywhere, collect data for a few days, and then see, you know, we don't have to be in a water area or things like that, like we typically had to in the before acoustic detectors became so popular. And with acoustics, we can learn a lot of cool things. Like, you know, this is an example of when bats left a roost. And so we get all this acoustic information, and then all of a sudden it's gone. And so we know, okay, the bats left around here. And so acoustics can really, like, there's a lot of flexibility with what we can do with that. And so lastly, just a couple things about disease surveillance. So especially with, for white nose syndrome, I don't think I did this slide right. This looks like something old, but white nose syndrome in particular, we do cave surveys, and we also, because not a lot of our bats in the West seem to roost in large congregations of caves like we think of in the Midwest and the East. They roost in rock crevices and things like that. And so disease surveillance is really tricky in the West. We can't just go in a cave and find a bunch of bats that we can swab. So so we end up we do mist netting in the early part of the season in the spring when bats are first kind of coming out of hibernation to try to detect white nose syndrome in Arizona. And another thing, during those surveys, we can look with UV light. White nose syndrome leaves this, what are you chewing on? Okay. Leaves this inflorescence on the bat wing using UV light that can be seen. And also a lot of times white nose syndrome will create all these scars and really degrade the bat's wing. So that's another thing that's looked for. But mostly we work with the National Wildlife Health Center, do a little swab on the bat physically, and then send those samples up to the health center, and they look there. Okay, the last couple things I'll say, bats are really cool because we're still discovering new things. You may have seen this in the news only like last week or within the last couple of weeks, a new bat species discovered in Africa. It was actually some colleagues at Bat Conservation International that were over there. And here's another cool picture. I mean, it's a really like remarkable looking bat, and it's a brand new discovery. And the big Mexican free-tailed bat colony I was talking about earlier with the video, that was just discovered about 10 years ago. And it was a Facebook tip that someone gave to me, who reached out to me like, hey, I think you should go check this out. There is a lot of bat guano in this site. And I was like, okay. We go out there and we were just blown away. And it's just amazing to think that there's that kind of stuff out there still to be discovered. And with bats, not only that, like there's so much we don't know about bats for all the things we think we know. So for folks who are interested in working with bats or with the department, there's great opportunities out there. Like I mentioned, I was an intern for 3 summers with the department. That's a really, really great way to get into the department if that's the way you want to go. I know that they're asking for the internship opportunity should be coming out in about a month or so. So I would, keep your eye out for that. Volunteer opportunities, great way. Like the bottom line is you want to get known by biologists working for the place you want to work for. And you also want to see what the job is like. So that's a great way to find out whether it's for you or not. Fieldwork sounds really glamorous, but like I said, I was crying on my first night. So it's like, it can be kind of rough. Also, as bad as the pandemic is, there are a lot of great opportunities to do things online. And so there's a few conferences coming up. So if you Google the Western Bat Working Group website, there's a conference, and I know the price is less than $50. I think it's pretty inexpensive for a student. It's going to be virtual, obviously. It's in April. A great way to see like what are the topics that bat biologists are talking about. NASBR is another big conference that will be virtual also. And we'll be having an Arizona bat meeting as well coming up. So you can reach out to me for more information about any of that. And that is what I got. So, and oh my God, this is the best meme ever.
Yeah, that is hilarious. That is so funny.
That's so good.
Okay, sorry I went to like really, but anyway, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer, or people can email me or whatever.
Yeah, I can send out the email. Oh yeah, Ellie, go.
So when you were talking about the different species that live in Arizona, you said there were 3 different ones that are nectar-eating bats. Are those the ones that are pollinating saguaros and other cactuses?
Yeah, there's three leaf-nosed bats. 2 of them are nectar eating and pollen eating, and they do pollinate saguaro cactus as well as agaves. So they're kind of in the southwestern part of the state with a lot of focus on columnar cactus in the spring and summer, early summer, and then they migrate kind of to the southeastern part of Arizona for the late summer and early fall. They also show up at hummingbird feeders in the Tucson area, and but they primarily eat agave pollen at that point. So they kind of follow the blooming plants. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was
Yeah,
messing
no,
with the
and
mute
the
button.
California leaf-nosed bat is also, but it doesn't, it is, we actually have some of those in the Phoenix area. They have really big eyes, big ears, but they're a gleaning bat. So they actually pick things off of vegetation and eat big bugs. A lot of times I'll get calls from people in the Phoenix area saying, oh, there's a bat making a huge mess on my patio. And sometimes it's this bat because it'll take a big juicy bug back to someone's patio and eat it there and leave kind of a mess.
Thank you.
Yeah. Stop sharing my screen. That's what oops.
Hey, I was wondering if there's been any of the white nose fungus discovered in Arizona, and also if you're worried at all about the new coronavirus, how that will affect Arizona bats.
Yeah, good questions. So far, so I'll start with coronavirus because it kind of impacts the what we know about white nose. There is some concern. There has been some concern about whether humans could give COVID-19 to bats. But there have been some studies with big brown bats trying to inoculate them that they, didn't come down with COVID-19. So, but as a result of that, and also kind of due to COVID, there really hasn't been any bat work ongoing for the last year. So in the year prior, we had detected a really, really small amount of fungus. And it was at a level that technically it didn't fit the definition of presence. But because it was just so slightly detected, we want to, definitely look back in that area. And that's kind of the plan this year, to look in the area to see, was that, we don't know if that means it's on, it's there at really low levels, or if it was a false positive kind of a finding or what. So we're definitely going to be looking more at that this year.
Thanks. And you said there's been a huge drawdown on like actual in-person surveys because of the pandemic. Wow.
Yeah. So, mostly, so at Game and Fish, we are still allowed to do field work. We have to follow certain protocols. With bats, like manning mist nets and things requires a certain number of people. So, an experienced crew can certainly do it, but kind of the combination of the COVID and concern for bats, there just really wasn't anything going on last year. But this year we're looking at revising our kind of recommendations to other bat researchers in the state, since we review and approve scientific collecting permits, and are probably going to open it up a bit more, because I don't really think the COVID-19, us giving it to bats, or at least, with the vaccine and wearing masks and things like that, I think we can do it safely. But it did put a damper on a lot of stuff last year for, both reasons.
Yeah, I remember that. There was I was working with a professor at Polytech campus, and we were doing some bat surveys, and it was like the first week of March when ASU was coming back from spring break, everything just got shut down on the spot.
Yeah, exactly. Was it Marianne Moore or someone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah, I've worked with Dr. Moore. We actually have done some cave surveys up in northern Arizona, to just get more information about what do bats do in the wintertime. It's so crazy. White nose is kind of the silver lining kind of thing with white nose, is there really wasn't a lot of focus in the West because you just never see bats in the wintertime. And it's really challenging to find them. And so there's been, more money available and just more emphasis on trying to figure out what are the important resources for bats in the winter.
Yeah. And there's so many, there must be so many unknown spots like where they could be living.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, like in the Midwest and the East, things just really shut down for several months. There's no food available, there's no water. A lot of times it's frozen up. Well, we don't have that situation here, but it does get cold, so we have kind of maybe a mix of bats. Like, I mean, bats living around the Grand Canyon, they could fly, if they're at the base of the canyon, it's going to be like Phoenix temperatures, and then at the top of the canyon it's like Flagstaff temperatures. I mean, they could just fly and probably get bugs and stuff, just with that elevational difference. So you have really a mix, but also I think we have a lot of cracks and crevices that aren't necessarily available to bats in other parts, and bats that need to kind of congregate in these humid caves for the purpose of hibernation, and they don't need to do it that way out here because our climate's just different. They maybe have shorter bouts of torpor instead of 2 months of hibernation.
Yeah, and I guess it wouldn't be as like, I don't know if this is true, but I would imagine it wouldn't be as damaging if they had to come out of, like, say what they were infected, if they had to go out into the environment to like find more water or food, they wouldn't just immediately die, right? There's much more options in this kind of climate.
That's kind of what we've thought, yeah, we're worried about white nose, but I don't know how worried to be. There's a lot of differences, in the East. Like, we don't even know what it would look like if it shows up here, because in the East, the first things they saw were piles of dead bats in caves.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say that we wouldn't see that, because maybe we would. They were also finding dead bats in the snow on the landscape. So I think out here, our bats are so much more dispersed during the winter time. So I think it's important to keep an open mind. But yeah, I just I can't wrap my mind around how they would starve in the same way here that they do there. But I try to keep an open mind about it, because sometimes it's not, it's not gonna be a problem, and that's probably, it could be.
Yeah, prepare for the worst, hope for the best.
Yeah. Hey, stop it. Ziggy.
So for internships, I know it's taking Game and Fish a while. I know it's
dog.
cute. I know it's taking Game and Fish a while to figure out the internship situation, but are you looking at getting interns yourself?
I'm not going to have any bad interns this year. I'm going to wait for COVID to be more of a thing in the past. But
yeah,
they did actually, the email was just going around today for people to put in their requests for interns and things like that. So it'll be out. We have a new Southwest Bat Hub coordinator. And it's a Bat Conservation International employee that's going to be working closely with us. And so there'll be a lot of volunteer opportunities that way to help with the acoustics. And that probably will prompt, I'll probably have an intern next year. I plan to ask for one. Plus that Gilbert Bridge that I was talking about, I don't even, know exactly how we're going to pull all that off, but it's going to be kind of a big process of figuring out how to exclude the bats from that bridge and do all that. So I could see really needing an intern's help next year.
Right. Cool. Thank you.
Do we get, I don't know if there's any chat questions or anything. Oh, are we recording? Bat bag. Okay.
Cool. Well, if that's it, yeah, thank you very much
Absolutely.
for presenting.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody's attention. And like I said, if Sabrina wants to pass my information out to anyone who wants to contact me, feel free. If you're looking for volunteer opportunity or have other questions or whatever.
Great.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right.
And I put
Thank
the
you.
all the links that that we brought up at the beginning. If you guys were late, we have officer applications, fill out attendance. That's it.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Angie.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night,
Stay
everybody.
safe. All right.
Have a
Bye.
good night.